There are generals who study war in books, and there are generals who learned it from the 500 lashes the British Army put on their back. Daniel Morgan was the second kind, and on this frozen morning, the British are about to discover what that education produced. It is still dark on January 17, 1781. The air over a South Carolina cow pasture is cold enough to burn the lungs. Frost clings to the dead winter grass. Somewhere in the darkness, a man with a ruined back is walking. He moves stiffly. The pain in his spine has been with him for years, a souvenir of the Saratoga campaign that never healed. But he does not stop. He walks from campfire to campfire, crouching beside clusters of shivering men, speaking to each one. His name is Daniel Morgan. He is 45 years old. He is an illiterate former Teamster from the Virginia frontier. And in the next 60 minutes, he is going to do something that no American commander has done before, or will do again for another century. Behind him, barely a mile away, the broad river cuts through the frozen landscape. There is no bridge. There is no ford his men can cross quickly. If this battle goes wrong, there is nowhere to run. Morgan chose this ground on purpose. He wants his men to know that the only way home is through the British Army standing in front of them. In approximately 1 hour, over 800 British soldiers will be killed, wounded, or captured. An elite force that has terrorized the Carolina backcountry for months will simply cease to exist. And the man who makes it happen will be an illiterate wagoner whose back is a map of British scars. This is the Battle of Cowpens. It saved the American Revolution, and almost no one in America has heard of it. By January 1781, the American Revolution in the South was not struggling. It was dying. Charleston had fallen. General Gates had been routed at Camden so completely that his army scattered across 3 states. The British controlled the Carolinas. Loyalist militias burned Patriot farms. And somewhere in the backcountry of South Carolina, a small battered American force was running for its life. The man leading that force had a resume that read like a novel, written by someone who did not believe in happy endings. Daniel Morgan was born in New Jersey to a family of hunters. He ran away from home as a teenager. He could barely read his own name. He had driven wagons for the British Army during the French and Indian War, and during that service, he had punched a British officer. The punishment was 500 lashes. Not 50, not 100, 500. The kind of punishment that leaves a man's back looking like a map drawn in scar tissue. It nearly killed him. It did not break him. It gave him a hatred of the British crown that never faded. By 1781, Morgan was 45, which made him old for this war. His spine was wrecked from sciatica. He walked like a man twice his age, and Nathaniel Greene, the new Southern commander, had just given him an independent force and told him to do something, anything. Slow the British advance, disrupt their supply lines, buy time. The man chasing Morgan was his opposite in every conceivable way. Banastre Tarleton was 26 years old, son of a wealthy Liverpool merchant family, Oxford educated. He had arrived in America looking for glory and had found it, slashing his way through every engagement with a recklessness that earned him 2 nicknames, Bloody Ban and the Butcher. At Waxhaws, his cavalry had cut down surrendering American soldiers. Men with their hands raised, men on their knees, sabered where they knelt. The atrocity burned in the memory of every militiaman in the Carolinas. Behind Tarleton rode 1,150 men. Not all of them were monsters. Many were Scottish Highlanders from the 71st Regiment, crofters and farmers from the Highlands, displaced by enclosures, shipped across an ocean they had never expected to cross, fighting a war in a country they did not understand. Others were loyalist provincials from New York and the Carolinas, Americans fighting Americans, men who had chosen the crown and now had no way back. They were professionals, they were experienced, and they had not slept properly in a week. Tarleton was aggressive the way a hammer is aggressive, powerful, direct, and incapable of subtlety. And a hammer, if you know where it is going to fall, can be turned into a trap. Morgan reached the place called Hannah's Cowpens on the afternoon of January 16th. It was not a fort, it was not a ridge, it was a cow pasture. 500 yards of open, flat grazing land with a gentle hill at the far end, woods on the flanks, and the broad river a mile behind. To any trained European officer, it was the worst possible ground to defend. No cover, no obstacles, no escape route. Most commanders would call this suicidal. Morgan called it insurance. Here is the logic that every trained officer missed. Morgan knew militia ran. It was what they did. They fired once and melted into the trees. But what if the river behind them meant that running was not an option? What if the only direction that led to safety was forward, through the British, and then behind the hill where the Continentals waited? Morgan was not choosing bad ground. He was choosing ground that removed the one option he could not afford: flight. His force numbered roughly 1,000 men, and calling them an army required generosity. 150 riflemen, backcountry sharpshooters from Virginia and the Carolinas, who could hit a man at 250 yards, but had never stood in a formal battle line. 300 militia under Andrew Pickens, a 52-year-old South Carolina farmer, Irish Presbyterian, Indian fighter, a man whose wife Rebecca waited at home, not knowing if her husband would come back from this one. Behind them, the backbone. 400 Continentals, regulars from Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia, the closest thing Morgan had to professional soldiers. And on the right flank, hidden from view behind the hill, 100 cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, 29 years old, Virginia planter, cousin of the commanding general, a man who had nearly died crossing the ice at Trenton 4 years earlier. 2 small artillery pieces. That was everything. Tarleton's force was larger, 1,150 men. His corps was the 71st Highland Regiment, among the finest infantry in the British Army. Crofters and farmers from the Scottish Highlands, displaced by enclosures, shipped across an ocean they had never expected to cross, fighting a war in a country they did not understand. Alongside them marched the British Legion, Tarleton's own mixed cavalry and infantry unit, plus Loyalist provincials and New York volunteers. They carried 2 field cannons. Their officers were experienced. Their discipline was real. But these men had been in pursuit for days. Roused at 2 in the morning on January 17th, they had stumbled 20 to 30 miles through freezing darkness. No breakfast, no rest. Some had slept fewer than 3 hours a night for the past week. By the time they reached the edge of that cow pasture, they were running on nothing but training and Tarleton's voice at their backs. Morgan's plan was simple to describe and insane to attempt. 3 lines stacked 150 yards apart across the open pasture. First line, the riflemen, positioned farthest forward. Their job was to fire at the officers, anyone on horseback, anyone giving orders, then fall back. Second line, Pickens's militia. Their job was to fire 2 aimed volleys into the advancing British at 50 yards, then turn around and walk, not run, to the rear, around the left side of the hill, and reform behind the Continentals. Third line, the Continentals on the hill. They hold. They do not move. They are the Anvil. And Washington's cavalry, invisible behind the hill's reverse slope, waits for the moment everything comes together. The plan required the militia to do 3 things militia had never done in this war: shoot accurately, absorb an advancing charge without breaking, and retreat in good order. Every military manual of the 18th century said the same thing about militia. They break, they run, they fire once and disappear into the trees. Daniel Morgan's entire plan depended on militia doing what every book in the world said they could not do. On the night of January 16th, Morgan made his decision. He would not cross the river. He would not keep running. He would use the river, use the impossibility of retreat to ensure that every man in his force understood there was nowhere to go but forward. And then, in the frozen darkness, Daniel Morgan did something no general in this war had ever done. He walked among his men, every single one of them, not as a general giving an address from horseback, as a man who understood that most of the soldiers lying in the frost had never been in a real battle and were terrified. He went to the riflemen first. He crouched beside their fires and spoke quietly. "You know what a British officer looks like? Epaulets, sashes, men on horseback. Those are your targets. Shoot them and fall back. That is all I ask." Then he moved to the militia. 300 men, many of whom had seen what Tarleton's cavalry did to militia at Camden, run them down in the open and cut them to pieces. Morgan did not pretend that would not happen here. He told them the truth. And then, he told them something that no American general had ever said to militia before. "Just hold up your heads, boys. Give me 2 fires and you are free. 2 aimed volleys." That was the contract. Not an order from above. A deal between men. You give me 2 volleys, I give you your life. After that, they could retire behind the hill and let the Continentals do the rest. In the entire history of the American Revolution, no general had ever spoken to militia like that. Like they were men whose fear deserved respect, not contempt. He asked each man if he understood. He shook their hands. He called some of them by name. Morgan was not a traditional commander. He was a former Teamster who had been whipped 500 times by the British Army and never forgotten it. He knew what it felt like to be the man at the bottom, the one nobody explained anything to. And he was determined that every man on this field would know his part. Then he walked to the Continentals. These men needed a different message. They were regulars, Marylanders, Virginians, men from Delaware who had held the line at Camden when everything around them collapsed. Morgan told them they were the wall. "Let the militia come through you. Do not fire until you see the British at 50 yards. Then give them everything." While Morgan talked, Tarleton marched. At 2 in the morning, he had roused his column. 1,100 men stumbled onto frozen roads in the dark. No fires for breakfast, no time to cook. Tarleton's scouts had reported Morgan's position, and the young colonel saw his chance. Hit the Americans at dawn before they could run again. The march was brutal. 20 to 30 miles through backcountry South Carolina in January. Men staggered under their packs. The Highlanders, big men from the Scottish hills, used to cold but not to this kind of forced march on empty stomachs, kept formation through discipline alone. By the time they reached Cowpens, some had been awake for over 24 hours. They were about to attack a rested enemy in a prepared position at dawn. And not a single officer in Tarleton's column suggested they wait. Tarleton reached the edge of the cow pasture as the first gray light crept over the trees. He could see campfires. He could see movement on the far side of the field. He did not reconnoiter. He did not send scouts to probe the American flanks. He did not wait for his men to eat or rest. He ordered his Legion dragoons forward. The first shots came from the American riflemen. They were lying in the grass, 150 yards ahead of the militia line, invisible in the pre-dawn murk. The British cavalry, 50 dragoons sent forward as a screen, came trotting toward them in a loose line. The riflemen waited. At 100 yards, they fired. 15 dragoons went down in the first seconds. Horses screamed and reared. Men tumbled from saddles. A Pennsylvania long rifle at 100 yards was not a musket. It was a precision instrument in the hands of men who had been shooting squirrels since they were 12. The surviving dragoons wheeled and galloped back toward the British line. 15 men down before the battle had even properly started. This is the moment Tarleton should have paused. His cavalry screen had just been shot from their saddles by riflemen they could barely see in the gray morning light. But Bonastre Tarleton did not pause. He had never paused in his life. He ordered his infantry forward. The full line, Highlanders in kilts and red coats, Legion infantry, Loyalist provincials, drums rolling, shoulder to shoulder, bayonets fixed, a wall of red and steel stretching across the open pasture. It was the formation that had shattered American lines at Camden, at Savannah, at Charleston. It was the formation that terrified Militia. The riflemen fired again from their positions, picking off officers as they had been told. A man on horseback crumpled. A sergeant giving orders went silent. Then the riflemen pulled back, melting toward the militia line as Morgan had instructed. The British kept coming. 500 yards of open ground lay between Tarleton's advancing line and the hill where the Continentals waited. But Tarleton was not looking at the hill. He was looking at the militia, 300 men standing in the open with nothing between them and the finest infantry in the world. He had seen this before. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He was wrong. The British came on in their line, drums beating, bayonets catching the first light. The distance closed. 300 yards, 200, 150. The militia could see their faces now. Young men, mostly. Some of the Highlanders were enormous, broad-shouldered farmers from the Scottish hills. The Legion infantry marched with the mechanical precision of men who had done this dozens of times. The ground shook slightly under their boots. Pickens waited. 52 years old. Farmer. Father. He had told his men what Morgan had told him. 2 volleys aimed low at 50 yards, then walked to the left around the hill. He knew the difference between a retreat and a rout was about 3 seconds of panic. He would not give his men those 3 seconds. He would give them a direction, a destination, and a reason to keep walking. At 50 yards, Pickens gave the order. 300 muskets fired almost as one. The sound was enormous, a single sustained crack that rolled across the pasture like thunder. Smoke erupted in a thick white wall. Through it, the British lines staggered. Men fell. Gaps opened. Officers shouted to close ranks. The militia reloaded. 14 seconds, maybe 15. The British were still coming, stepping over their dead. Pickens gave the order again. The second volley tore into the line at 40 yards. More men fell. The smoke was so thick now that neither side could see more than a few feet, and then the militia turned and walked away. Morgan's contract held. 2 volleys, then freedom. To the British, it looked like a collapse. The militia was streaming away from the line, moving quickly toward the hill, some of them running now despite Pickens' orders. British officers screamed to charge. The line surged forward. Discipline frayed as men broke into a ragged sprint, chasing the retreating Americans across the open ground. The careful linear formation that was the British Army's greatest weapon began to come apart as exhausted men chased what they believed was a beaten enemy up a gentle slope. In every other engagement of this war, this is where the American line disintegrates and the British walk through the wreckage. Tarleton had seen it happen half a dozen times. He was certain he was seeing it again. He was wrong. This was exactly what Morgan had planned. The British were doing precisely what he knew they would do. What the hammer always does: fall on the place where the target used to be. Because the target had already moved. Morgan's gamble was paying off. But Tarleton could not see what was happening behind that hill. The British crossed 200 yards of open pasture at something between a jog and a sprint. Unit cohesion dissolved. The Highlanders on the right surged ahead of the center. The Legion infantry on the left fell behind. Officers, the ones still alive, tried to restore order, but the momentum of the chase was pulling the line apart like a fraying rope. The smoke from the militia volleys still hung over the field in patches. Visibility was terrible. These men had not slept or eaten. They were running uphill on adrenaline and nothing else. And then they looked up. For the first time, they saw what was waiting. 400 Continentals in a solid line, bayonets leveled, muskets aimed downhill, fresh troops who had not fired a shot. The British had been running for 5 minutes. Their line was ragged. Their ranks were thin. They had left their dead behind them across 200 yards of open ground. And now they were staring up a slope at the one thing Daniel Morgan had promised them. the wall. The Continentals fired at 50 yards. The volley was devastating. A disciplined, concentrated blast that hit the leading British ranks like a physical force. Men went down in clusters. The advance stalled. Tarleton saw his line faltering and did what he always did. He sent in everything. He ordered the 71st Highlanders, his reserve, his best troops, to swing right and flank the Continental line. The Highlanders obeyed. They were the best soldiers on the field. They swung right, moving fast despite their exhaustion, and bore down on the American left flank. 39 out of 66 British officers would be killed or wounded at Cowpens. More than half the men giving orders in Tarleton's force were shot down. When officers fall, units do not retreat, they dissolve. John Eager Howard saw the Highlanders coming. 27 years old, an orphan from Maryland. He ordered his right company to wheel and face them. In the smoke and chaos, the movement was misunderstood. The company began to fall back. Other companies, seeing the movement, began to fall back too. And then, for 30 terrible seconds, everything Morgan had built threatened to collapse. The Continental line was retreating. Morgan rode forward. "Are you beaten?" he shouted. The men shook their heads. "Then face about and give them one more fire." What happened next has only been achieved a handful of times in the history of warfare. Hannibal did it at Cannae. No American commander had ever done it. A double envelopment, a simultaneous attack from front, flank, and rear, executed not by a professional European army, but by frontier riflemen, militia farmers, and a cavalry force smaller than a modern high school graduating class. Howard's Continentals stopped. They turned. They leveled their muskets at a range of 30 yards, close enough to see the brass buttons on the Highlanders' coats, and fired. The volley cut through the flanking column like a scythe. Before the smoke cleared, Howard screamed a single word: "Charge!" The Continentals fixed bayonets and went forward. They hit the staggering British line with a force that drove men backward. Bayonet against bayonet. Musket butt against skull. Men grappling in the smoke on frozen ground. At the same moment, William Washington's cavalry came around the right flank at a gallop. 100 horsemen slammed into the British left and rear. The cavalry sabered through the disorganized ranks, cutting off any possibility of retreat. And behind the hill, something happened that Tarleton had not imagined possible. Pickens' militia appeared on the British right, not fleeing, not scattered across the countryside, reloaded, rested, formed into a line, furious. These were the men the British had been chasing, the men who were supposed to have broken and scattered, the men whose fear Tarleton had counted on. They had not broken. They had walked behind a hill, reloaded their muskets, and come back. Morgan's contract had held. 2 volleys, then freedom. And now they were free, and they had chosen to return. The British were surrounded on 3 sides. The line broke. It did not retreat. It shattered. Men who had advanced in perfect formation 45 minutes earlier threw down their muskets and raised their hands. The Highlanders fought on longer than most. Pride, training, or simply the refusal to accept that this was how it ended. But one by one, they too went down or dropped their weapons. Tarleton tried to rally his Legion cavalry for a final charge. Most refused. The horsemen who had terrorized the Carolinas looked at the field, at the smoke, at the dead, at the surrendering hundreds, and turned their horses north. Tarleton, in his green jacket with the plumed helmet, found himself nearly alone on a field where 1,100 men had stood less than an hour ago. The cow pasture fell silent for the first time in an hour. The smoke began to clear. Across 500 yards of frozen grass, British dead lay in the patterns of their advance, scattered in a rough line from the spot where the dragoons had first been shot from their saddles to the base of the hill where the Continentals had held. The wounded moaned. The prisoners, hundreds of them, sat or knelt in the frost, too exhausted to stand. Some of the militia were laughing, the high, uncontrolled laughter of men who had expected to die and had not. Others sat down in the frozen grass and stared at nothing. A Continental from Maryland sat with his musket across his knees, looking at the field where the British dead lay in the patterns of their advance, and said nothing for a long time. The old teamster from the frontier sat on his horse and looked at what he had done. The man who had written to Greene that his force was inadequate had just executed the most complete tactical victory of the American Revolution. The numbers were staggering. Tarleton had arrived with 1,150 men. He escaped with roughly 160. British killed, approximately 110. Wounded, 229. Captured, the rest. 39 of 66 British officers were killed or wounded. Nearly 60% of every man giving orders in Tarleton's force was shot down. The 2 British field cannons were in American hands. 800 muskets, 35 supply wagons, 100 horses, an entire army's worth of equipment captured on a cow pasture. American losses, 12 killed, 60 wounded, not one man captured. 12 Americans dead against over 800 British killed, wounded, or captured. For every American who fell, nearly 70 British soldiers were removed from the war. In the mathematics of war, this was not a victory, it was an annihilation. Morgan did not celebrate. He knew Cornwallis was behind Tarleton with the main British army, and the clock was already running. By January 18th, one day after the battle, he had his force on the march north, driving the long column of captured British soldiers ahead of them on frozen roads. The race to the Dan River had begun. The news of Cowpens reached Nathaniel Greene like a thunderclap. He had been preparing for the worst, another Camden, another army destroyed. Instead, he received a report detailing a victory so complete it seemed exaggerated. Greene immediately recognized what Cowpens meant. The British grip on the South was broken. Cornwallis, furious at the destruction of his best light troops, burned his own baggage train to move faster in pursuit, a desperate act that would eventually lead him to Yorktown and the end of the war. The chain of cause and effect runs directly from a frozen cow pasture in South Carolina to the trenches of Yorktown 9 months later. More than that, Cowpens proved something that many on both sides had doubted: that American militia, properly led and properly used, could stand against British regulars and win, not by hiding behind walls or sniping from trees, but in the open, on flat ground, in a set-piece battle. Morgan had not asked his militia to be something they were not. He had asked them to be exactly what they were, frightened men with muskets, and he had built a plan that turned their fear into a weapon. That lesson changed the calculus of the war. Morgan himself would never fight again. The sciatica that had plagued him for years worsened in the weeks after Cowpens, aggravated by the cold and the brutal pace of the retreat north. By April 1781, he was forced to resign his command and return to his Virginia farm. The hero of Cowpens limped home in pain, his war over 3 months after his greatest triumph. He would live long enough to be elected to Congress in 1797. He died in 1802, an old man far from any battlefield. Pickens, whose militia had done the impossible, continued his partisan war across the Carolinas. Howard, the orphan from Maryland who had led the bayonet charge, became governor of Maryland. Tarleton became a British member of Parliament and received a knighthood, but he never escaped Cowpens. Every political opponent he ever faced threw that cow pasture in his face. He spent the rest of his life explaining why he had ridden north with 160 men out of 1,150. And here is perhaps the greatest irony. The battle that military historians call the tactical masterpiece of the American Revolution, the one engagement studied at West Point alongside Caney and Austerlitz, is the one most Americans have never heard of. Ask someone to name a battle of the Revolution. They will say Bunker Hill, Yorktown, maybe Saratoga. Almost no one says Cowpens. Cowpens had no ceremony, no formal surrender with fifes and drums. It had an old man with a bad back sitting on a horse in a cow pasture at dawn, watching his impossible plan work. Go back to that image from the beginning. The frost is still on the ground. The smoke is clearing. Somewhere to the north, Banastre Tarleton is riding hard with the shattered remains of his command. And Daniel Morgan, illiterate, battered, in more pain than he will admit to anyone, begins the long walk home. That is how revolutions are actually won. Not in the moments history remembers, but in the ones it forgets. Daniel Morgan could not read a book about tactics. He could not write his own name without difficulty. But he understood something that no book could teach, that the men standing in the frost were not soldiers. They were farmers and boys and frightened strangers. And the only way to make them fight was to make them believe that someone who understood their fear was standing beside them. 500 lashes taught him that. One frozen morning proved it.